Welcome to Winter Conference 2022. I am so excited that we're in-house. You know, if this is your first time at Winter Conference, I'm just so happy you're here. And if you've been to Winter Conference before, welcome back. One of the things that Justin McMenemy talked about in that opening session, that was an opening session, wasn't it? There are a lot of fun things we talked about there. But one of the things he mentioned was that we weren't taking our focus off the planter pass, right? We're still wanting to put our focus on the planter pass, and that's really where the heart of today's session is going to reside. We're going to talk about the planter details that make a difference, because we know how important that planter pass is in achieving the potential. And what we wanted to do, the heart of this presentation is really around what are the actionable things? What are the things that if you leave Winter Conference today, what can you go home and do in your shed tomorrow to make a difference? Because here at Precision Planting, as we've said it, we believe in better, and we're for farmers that believe in better, and that doesn't just mean better each season, it's better every acre, it's better every farm. And so we wanted to really unpack that today. Does that sound like a good plan? You got all good with that? Cool. So my name is Caleb Schleder. I get the opportunity to lead the product support team here at Precision Planting, and I also farm not too far down the road from here, about 8 miles west in Green Valley, Illinois. And this is where I really love to talk, because I'm so passionate about agriculture. As we start talking about getting better, and we start talking about the planter details that make a difference, that's where I get super excited. So if I get too excited, that's just tell me. It's okay. You can tell me. That's fine. But we're going to go ahead and dive into the presentation. That sound all right? All right. So up on the screen, you're probably wondering, Caleb, you just said we're going to talk about planters. And there's a picture of an old work truck up on the screen. Why'd you do that? Well, I figured with the used market the way it is, if anybody's willing to make me an offer, I mean, we could probably be a little bit more efficient than Auto Trader with this group, right? No, in reality, as we were going through this presentation, as I was thinking about planter maintenance and the way that we maintain our equipment on our operation, I look at this old work truck. Do we hold all equipment the same when it comes to maintenance on our operations? In our minds, we say no. And on this old work truck, the way I maintain it, you can kind of see it. We say it has old work truck syndrome, right? That driver's side door doesn't shut all the way. AC and heat, it's a good day if it works. Depending on the season you're in, it could be cold when it's cold outside. That's never good. We have a rocker switch that we spliced in order to engage four-wheel drive because the dial doesn't work anymore. And we have a little black sticker that we put over the transmission light mainly because we got tired of looking at it. You guys have one of these trucks on your operation? We maintain this type of a truck when we need to, not when we ought to, right? We're very reactive because I need this truck to do one thing. What is that? I need it to work, right? I need it to jockey parts to the field. I need it to jockey a pallet of seed to the field. Maybe I need to put a gearbox on there so I can go out and fix a pivot, but I need it to work. I need endurance out of it. So I'm not going to be proactive in how I maintain it because it's a piece of work equipment. Now, that also got me started thinking, are there some times where we look at all of our equipment on our farm the same and we maintain it the same, and so when you get into a situation where you have a piece of performance equipment, like what I have up on the screen, this is our planter. We're putting in no-till soybeans. This is in our South Kegley farm. Do we sometimes think the same way? Do we hold them equal? Do we sometimes maintain our planter when we need to and not when we ought to? Because when I think about performance, that's really what I think about. Shouldn't we maintain our planter as a performance machine when we ought to versus when we need to? Right? There's some times where we're out in the field and we see something that's going wrong and we say, do we need to make an adjustment? Do we need to fix it right now? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Because when it comes to performance and when it comes to a piece of performance equipment like our planter, we need it to perform on every row, over every acre, every farm, every field. And why is that important? Because performance is what is going to help us achieve our profitability, right? Yeah. And so when we start talking about performance on the planter pass, what are we trying to achieve? You heard it in Justin's session. You're going to hear it again after this session, but we're trying to achieve even and consistent emergence. That's what's going to help us find the potential of that seed that we took out of the bag and placed in the ground. And so what are the 3 key principles of consistent and even emergence? Number 1, what do we got to do? We got to put that seed in an even heat and moisture environment. We want to make sure that all of our seeds are placed in an even heat and moisture environment so that way they emerge consistently. Number 2, we want 360 degrees of soil around that seed. And then number 3, we want to make sure that in that furrow, we're freeing up from residue, we have good soil density, and we're not bringing in the air pockets. So those are the key measures that we want to go to in order to have even and consistent emergence. And so as we talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is our planter maintenance, that's really where we're going to sit. That's really where we're going to focus in on. And so I can't do that alone. I had to bring in some expertise. So I wanted to bring a team member from our product support team. Has anybody called our product support team here at Precision Planting? If you have, they're a great group of individuals. They're always for the grower. They're always wanting to help out, make sure that they're taken care of during season. And so I wanted to bring somebody along that's a part of that team to help me. So would you introduce yourself and tell us where we're going to go today?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Caleb. So my name is Tyler Hubert, and I'm a product support specialist here at Precision Planting. I get the privilege of working with Caleb and our support team on an everyday basis. I just want to echo what Caleb said in his introduction and just thank everybody for coming today. We're elated to have you all, if you can't tell that by the pitch of Caleb's voice when he presents. So let's dive into what we want to talk through today. And as Caleb and I were thinking through planter maintenance details that make a difference, we kind of split this into 3 different phases. And they are what you see up here on the screen: shed checks, field checks, and dollar checks. So phase 1, shed checks, is probably what most of us are getting into now or are soon going to be getting into on our farms. And that is the planter's in the shop, and we're going to start to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and make sure it's mechanically sound and ready to go for the spring. The second phase of this that we'll get into a little bit later is field checks. What Caleb and I kind of thought is, it'd be really cool if we could show some pictures from the field or what we might see in ground if any maintenance items are missed from that shed check phase. Now the final phase is going to be getting into dollar checks, because what we want for this conversation, what this session today is to tie it back to ROI. Justin talked about improving our farm income. That's what we're looking for here. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the shed checks portion. There's a couple housekeeping notes that I want to hit on before we get too deep here into shed checks. Number 1, we're not going to be talking about meters in this session today. And that's not because we don't think meters are important. We understand that they're critical. But we really want to focus in on row unit maintenance items. And the reason is we believe the best way to make sure a meter is ready to go for the spring is to put it on a stand and run the seed that you're going to plant come this spring. Now, the best way to do that is to take it to a premier precision planting dealer and have them test that meter. They have a stand that allows them to do that. Okay, so we understand meters are important, but we're going to make a little bit of an assumption here today that you're already doing that. You're taking your meters to a premier dealer to have them run. Now, the other thing is we don't have the opportunity today to go through every maintenance item on the planter, but Caleb and I have selected about 5 or 6 different maintenance items that we do want to touch on. And the reason we have selected these items is because they're fundamental. It does not matter what your tillage practice is, the color of your planter, the hybrid that you're planting, your fertility program. If these items are missed, it will be detrimental on your farm. Now, Caleb and I are going to be focusing in on some of these shed checks on this deer row unit right here. But I don't want everybody thinking that just because we're going to be operating on this guy right here, that's the only row unit that we care about.
No, definitely not. And that's why we have row units up here around me as well, is the things we're going to talk about don't only apply to one row unit, right? We're talking about the fundamentals. We're talking about the principles that we can employ on our operations in order to overcome some of these things that are going to pull away from our even and consistent emergence. And so as we're talking through these shed checks, and I know every row unit may be designed a little bit differently. It may have different equipment on it. You may have a different setup than your neighbor, right? But the things we're trying to understand and the things we're trying to avoid when we get into the field, those issues, those are principal issues. Those are things that we can apply what we're going to talk about across the board. So keep that in mind as we're going through it. We'll also have some examples up here of other row units as well, so that way we can just share that knowledge. But these are really fundamental in order to make sure that we're doing the right things.
Yeah, with that, Caleb, we'll jump into the first shed check. And we're going to talk about parallel alarms and the parallel alarm linkage. So when we talk about shed checks, what we thought here going through this presentation is, what are some checks that we can do on our row units with tools that most growers have available to them already in the shop? So what I want you to pay attention to is when we talk about action items, these shed checks are your action items. These are the things that Caleb and I were envisioning that you can take today and go to your farm tomorrow and do to make sure that the planter is mechanically sound. Why do I care about parallel alarm linkage, right? I said that's where we're going to start, so let's dive in there. If I have slop in my parallel alarm linkage, what that's going to cause is a chattering effect of my row unit as I go through the field. When I think of that chattering, I think about the seed drop. And what that's likely to cause is that seed to ricochet back and forth down my seed tube as I go through the field. The risk there is uneven spacing, right, or poor spacing because of that. So the shed check that I'm going to have Caleb do is actually to go to the row unit and lift it up, and he's trying to rock it back and forth. And what he's looking for is any slop or play in the row unit as he does that. Caleb, what'd you find?
There's definitely some slop up there.
Okay, all right. So at that point, what I'd probably do is I'd take the parallel alarm linkage off, and I would probably expect to see the picture on the left. Did anybody ever seen a parallel alarm that looks like that? I love it. I see some hand raises, but then I hear some chuckles, too. And that's the yes, that's the feedback I'm looking for there, too. Yeah, so at this point, I'm going to replace the parallel arm. I'm going to also replace the bushing and the nut that holds that all in place. I want those all wearing evenly together from new. All right, so with that, Caleb, we're going to continue down the row unit. We're going to talk about gauge wheel arms and the depth assembly.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. So the depth assembly, why is it so important when we get into our planter? Why is it so important to look into the details of our depth assembly? Well, we talked about that even and consistent emergence. And when we start talking about depth, that is affecting the environment we're placing our seed into, right? And so I have a question for you. Do you know that your row units are lying to you? Potentially. Did you know that? Now, what I mean by that is they might be giving you a little white lie or a really big lie, but your row units are lying to you because they can't tell you exactly where they're placing that seed. We may set our T-handles according to that operator's manual and say, hey, I know that this T-handle needs to be set to 2 inches. For our operation, for other crops, it's a different depth, but I know this is where I need to set my T-handle to achieve the depth that I want. And our row unit may say, hey, I'm at 2 inches, but in reality, I'm somewhere else. And why do they lie to us? Well, the reason they lie to us is if you look up on the screen, on the left-hand side, you can see a gauge wheel arm. That gauge wheel arm, you can see pitting on it, can't you? There's wear. And when that wear happens, we now have a variation in what we actually are placing that seed down at its depth. So you have this pitting up here on this gauge wheel arm. You go to the next row, and these are 2 gauge wheel arms from the same planter on 2 different rows. You may see a different level of wear, a different level of pitting out. And so now our rows may be telling us a different story. The other thing we have to talk about at this point is the mustache. Because
Caleb, I don't really think this is the time or place for that, but since you brought it up, I'd be interested for feedback. Is it something that you all think that I should keep? Are you more in the camp of my wife that it's probably time to shave?
The depth rocker. The depth rocker.
Me embarrassed.
Yeah,
go ahead and
the
continue,
details we're looking for, not on Tyler's face, right? The depth rocker, we want to make sure we're looking at that because you have the depth rocker and you have the pivot bolt there. Now, on the left-hand side, you can also see that we have some wear on that pivot bolt. So if you add the wear on our gauge wheel arm, the wear on our pivot bolt, now we're bringing in those small tolerances. These are small amounts of wear that turn into that big lie, right? And so how do we get the row units to tell us the truth? Now, I don't think we need to put them across from a table and Tyler and I play good cop, bad cop and interrogate them to tell us the truth. No, there's something much easier. We're going to do what we call a shed check, and that shed check is the block check. So over here on our 4-row planter, we actually have a block check set up. What we did is we just took 4x4s, and if you can't see it right now, that's fine. You can get up after the session, take a look. But we just took 4x4s, and we put it to a 1/2-inch plywood base, and we slid it under. And we scribed 2 inches on those 4x4s for it to tell us exactly where it is. And you can see up on the screen, there's some variation, isn't there? This is row 1, and this is row 2. These are the same pictures we got on row 1 and row 2 on this planner. If we put a line up there, you can definitely see the variation, right? We have one, and the T-handles are set in the same place. We have one that's above the 2-inch mark and one that's below, so our row units are lying to us. So now what do we have to do? In order to true it up, we're going to raise that planner. We're going to get our T-handle set to where it's actually to the depth that we want it to be. In our situation, it's 2 inches. And then we want to mark where that T-handle is. Now we've made that row unit tell us the truth. Now we know exactly where we're placing that seed so we can get in the even heat and moisture environment. In our situation at 2 inches, we may get some grace, especially if we're in the central Illinois area. That's where we operate, right? We may get some grace when it comes to corn, but if you start to see this in the cotton world, man, that's deadly to be 1 inch or a 1/2 inch deeper than what you want to be. So this is just something that's key when we start talking about our shed checks. Make sure we have our row units telling us the truth. And if we start looking down, as I talked about earlier, the other row units out there, this holds true for that. This is a Kinsey row unit. You can see the pitting out here. That's going to change our depth, or what the row unit is telling us. And then if you look at our case, we're no longer looking at the back of the row unit. We're wanting to go to the front. And so our depth assembly, we're wanting to inspect for areas of wear. Just taking the time to look into those details in order to make the adjustments. Next up, we want to talk about our gauge wheel. So we talked about the gauge wheel arm and how it relates to depth. Now we want to talk about our gauge wheel itself. Why is this so important? Well, if you look up on the screen there on the left-hand side, you can actually see a gap there, can't you, between our gauge wheel arm and our disc opener, or gauge wheel and our disc opener? There's a gap there. What's that gap doing? Well, what it's going to allow is it's going to allow dry soil to enter into our furrow. And as we recall, when I was talking about even and consistent emergence, we were talking about we need an even and heat moisture environment. If we're bringing dry soil and placing it to our furrow, are we achieving that? No, we sure aren't. So now what do we have to do? We want to do a shed check in order to make sure that our gauge wheels are set properly in relation to our disc opener, so we don't bring that in. We don't bring that dry soil into our furrow. So Tyler is actually going to help me out here. He's going to showcase how we do a shed check on our gauge wheel. What he's going to do is he's going to lift up that gauge wheel, then he's going to pull it away, and he's going to feel on the area where that gauge wheel and opener disc connect, and he's going to see if he can feel a gap. If he can feel a gap, we might have an issue. The other thing he's going to do is he's just going to lift it up, and he's going to let go. Did you see any rotation?
I didn't.
So what we're looking for there is we're looking for that gauge wheel to slightly rotate forward. That means we have good contact. That means we're no longer allowing that dry soil to enter into our furrow. So Tyler's going to make an adjustment here, so that way we shim that gauge wheel closer to the disc opener. Now here's what else I'll say. Tyler's getting the opportunity to make the adjustment. We're going to bring it closer in. If you are working to make an adjustment to shim that gauge wheel closer to your disc opener and you run out of adjustment room, it may be time to replace your gauge wheel. Why do I say that? Because on the inner side of that gauge wheel, that rubber is going to be wearing on that disc opener, isn't it? And so we may get to a point where we lose the ability to adjust it. We lose the ability to correct it. And so we want to make sure that we're getting it to that point. So now, Tyler, we've made our adjustment. We've got it in a good spot. Tyler's going to lift it back up. Everybody see that rotation forward? That's what we're looking for. That's telling us that we've got good contact between our gauge wheel and our disc opener. So now that we've talked about that gauge wheel in relation to our disc opener, we're going to go further into disc openers. And Tyler, will you take us there?
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
All right, so the first thing that I'm concerned about with my opening discs, I want to make sure that they're touching each other. So, if you look at the picture up here on the left, I've got a set of opening discs that are not touching. When I see that, I'm at a significant risk of creating what we call a W bottom or a W trench. So if you think about that trench, it's actually formed in the shape of a W. And the risk that I have there is air pockets around my seed. So, like you see on the right, I've got a set of opening discs that are touching. That's good. That's what I want. But to take this one step further, it's not just that they're touching. There's a certain amount of contact that I'm looking for. So the shed check that we're going to do is I'm going to have Caleb slide a business card in from the front and the back of our opening discs. Once he does that, he's going to measure the distance in between those business cards, just like you see up here on the picture. Now, the proper distance between the business card is going to vary based on the thickness of our blade. All right, so refer to your OEM or to a maintenance guide as to what that contact distance should be. But the other piece of this is I'm going to have Caleb check in 3 different places on our opening disc. Check contact in 3 different places. And I want the contact to be fairly consistent over those 3 places that I check. And if there is significant variance in the distance of that contact point, it could be caused by a few different things. It could be an uneven wear of the blade. Could be that the hub is off-center. Could be that our blade is warped. I want to talk through some of those things. So Caleb's going to go ahead and buzz the opening disc off here. And I mentioned one of the things that could cause that contact point to vary significantly as we check in multiple spots could be a warped blade. So I could have this obviously on a used disc here, or I could have it on a brand new disc like you see up here in the picture. So it's an easy shed check here, right? I lay that opener flat on my workbench and I'm looking to see, just like you see up here, do I see any warping of that blade? The reason I care about this, folks, it's going to affect the consistency of my depth. That's why we're doing this. Okay? Now the other couple things that I mentioned is we could have some uneven wear, or the hub could be off-center. So I'm going to talk through another check here that we can do to verify that. So Caleb has put a bolt in a vise. He's making sure that it's plumb. And what he's going to do is he's going to slide my opening disc over that bolt, and he's going to slowly spin it. He's going to test his DJ skills. Okay? And what he's got in his left hand is a ratchet wrench extension, and he's using that as a reference. And he's looking to see, does the edge of that disc ever change in the distance from the edge to that extension? Now that might be a little bit hard to see. So when we were making some of our practice runs, we recorded this. So the disc that Caleb has here is the one you see on the left, and you can see the extension right up next to that. And watch as that disc turns. It stays really consistent. The edge of that stays really consistent to the distance it is away from the extension. Now if I move over to one of the discs we took off of this row unit that's on the right, what you're going to see is that distance changes. We'll keep watching there. Fairly close here, and then we're going to get further away here in a second. Everybody see that? So again, that can happen because of uneven wear, or my hub might be off-center. So I need to check and make sure that the hub is centered on an opening disc, on a used and on a new opener. And just to illustrate that point, I'm going to talk through this slide. We took a new opening disc and we drew a circle around that center hub. And we drew another circle equidistant from that center circle. We made a third circle around the outside of the disc, and what you can see here is my center circle favors the top side of my disc. So I've got some evidence there that my hub is off-center even on this brand new disc. Now on the farm, doing the test that Caleb just talked through here would find this. Okay, for the sake of presentation, we put this slide together. Okay? You could also just measure from the center of the hub to the edge of your disc. Right? Now why do we care about this? Guys, if you think about that disc turning going through the field, that's going to change our planting depth. That's why we care. Right? And we know there's some opening discs out there that have this going on. That's why we're talking through it. Okay? The final shed check that I'm going to do is I'm going to have Caleb measure across the opening disc. Again, as we've said, we're using a John Deere row unit here. Brand new, that disc should measure 15 inches. When it measures less than 14.5 inches, we want to replace that disc. If we keep using that disc, we're going to wear into some of the components between our openers. All right, so I've got 4 other row units up here. I've got a couple other distances, some 16, some 14. Right? Refer to your OEM as to when it's time to replace that disc. It's just to call it out that while we've got that off, we're going to measure across that disc and find out if she's worn out. Okay? Caleb, in between the opening discs, we've got the seed tube guard.
Yeah, we sure do.
Let's dive into it.
All right. So the seed tube guard, it serves 2 functions. Do we know what those 2 functions are? Well, the first one's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's in its name. It's there to guard the speed tube. It's there to protect the speed or the seed tube, right? We're talking about guarding that seed tube. Why is it so important? When we have that seed tube there and it starts to have premature wear, what's going to happen? We're actually going to see that plastic curl inwards on the seed exit. And when that plastic curls inwards and we start to see that happen, we're going to impact our seed release. It's going to change potentially our seed spacing. We may have an issue when it comes to that. Now, what's the second function of the seed tube guard? In my opinion, it's a more important function of that seed tube. That seed tube guard, the second function that's really important is it's going to make sure that our disc openers, when we place them into the ground and they flex, because that's what's going to happen, they're going to flex inwards. They don't flex to a point where we create what we call a narrow furrow. Right? We want to make sure that we're creating a consistent furrow, and if our seed tube guard is not to spec, those discs will flex so close that it could end up potentially changing where we're placing our seed at depth. We could have done everything right on our depth assembly, and our seed tube guard is still changing our depth because our discs are flexing inward. The other thing that happens in that situation is our discs, they bring on some wear that we weren't anticipating, right? Those hubs and those bearings, they're putting more pressure on them. So that seed tube guard, it's a small part, but man, it does a lot of different things for us. And so when we start talking about seed tube guards, we want to understand, how do we check this? How do we do a shed check? And when we look up on the screen here, this is actually our speed tube guard. Speed tube is Precision Planning's high-speed planner option. But our speed tube guard, what we have is we have a spec. And we communicate that spec. And we say, hey, if your speed tube guard is small, it has a width that's less than 0.64 inches, you need to replace. Now, I don't know if any of you have a digital caliper in your toolbox. I personally don't. So now I need to go and I need to figure out, well, I'm going to use the tried and true method of measuring tape, right? So now I want to measure that. If I end up having 0.64, I know that it's no longer serving its function. If it's less than that, I know that it's not doing the job I need it to. And so there's other examples of this out in the industry. We actually have Twitter posts, and this is where Twitter is amazing, right? For ag Twitter, I love ag Twitter. There's a lot of those interesting nuggets that come across. But we had a dealer of ours post a picture of a seed tube guard and just said, hey, as a reminder, seed tube guards need to be replaced when it's at 3/4 inches because it's not doing the job that it's intended to if we allow it to go any further and wear down further than that. So if you look up here on the screen on the left-hand side, you can see a seed tube guard that's definitely worn past the point that we want it to, right? So Tyler, how we're going to do this shed check is Tyler's going to take this measuring tape, and he's actually going to measure our seed tube guard. And we want to know if it's within spec. We close?
About 5/8 of an inch.
Okay, so we're not within spec. So now we have to replace, essentially. That's what we want to do so it's serving its function. There are other times where it may be 3/4 inches. And if we're doing our shed check before we even get out in the field and it's at 3/4 inches or a little bit above that, should we talk about replacement? Is it going to last through the entire season? That's some of the calculus that we need to do when we're doing these shed checks. Is it going to last me? Am I going to perform not just on acre 0, but acre 600? Not just on acre 600, but acre 1200? When we start talking about other brands, you have Case with a forming point. Case has actually given us this nice tool in order to understand when we need to replace our forming point. If you look up here, they give you this guide that says, hey, you place the forming point within this space here, And if you can see your forming point through that triangle, you're good to go. And in this situation here, we know we need to replace. We can't see it through that triangle, right? It's a good idea to replace so it does the job it's intended to. So now we've got the seed out. It's in the furrow. Now we want to firm it. So Tyler, you want to talk to us about seed firmers?
Absolutely. All right, seed firmer is sort of acting as a thumb, if you will, pressing that seed gently into the bottom of our seed trench and making sure we surround that seed with good moist soil on all sides. Now there's a proper amount of tension that we're looking for on our seed firmer, and that's 20 ounces. Okay, 20 ounces. Now the shed check that we're going to do to verify that 20 ounces, actually, we have purchased a fish scale. So first step, and I know this because Roger Musselman in our support department, he's the Keaton guru. He's the seed firmer guru. He's really pounded this into my head. We got to make sure that that fish scale is calibrated first. So we took a pint of water, which actually on the label on the water it says 16.9 ounces, and we hang it off our fish scale to make sure that we round up 17 ounces here in this case. But then what we're going to do is we're going to lower the planter. We've wrapped a wire around our firmer. We're going to link the other end or hook the other end onto our fish scale. With the planter lowered, Caleb's going to start to pull up on the scale. And when that firmer comes up off the ground, we want 20 ounces. I'll repeat that. We're going to pull up on the fish scale. When the firmer comes up off the shop floor, I want 20 ounces. Caleb, what do you got?
We're a little shy. We're actually at about 10.
10. Okay. So there's two types of brackets that we have here at Precision Planting to hold the firmer in place. The first one is actually what's in the picture here on the left and on that 4-row planter we just did our shed check on. It's called a universal bracket. Kind of sandwiches the firmer in between it. If you can't achieve 20 ounces when doing this shed check on a universal bracket, this little bolt right here on the front of the bracket, you can tighten that until you are able to achieve 20 ounces.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say I don't think we got enough bolt to tighten that guy.
Careful out there on that limb, Caleb. So the other type of bracket is a quick attach. That's actually what's up here on the deer row unit. If we can't achieve 20 ounces of tension on a quick attach bracket firmer, we're going to replace the whole thing. And it's real easy, as Caleb just demonstrated. It's got a little tab on top. You depress, you pull it out, you snap a new one in. Okay. Caleb, this is where we kind of get to the fun part. And when we were thinking through this presentation and we moved into phase 2 for field checks, I mentioned this earlier, but our heart was really around, I would want to know, if it were me, if I miss any of these maintenance items, what's it going to look like in the field?
You bet.
Would you pick back up? And we're going to jump into talking about seed spacing.
Yeah. So this is where we get to have fun, right? We've done our shed checks. We've made sure that our planter was ready for success before we left out of the shed. And now we're actually in the field. So if you've called into product support, one of the questions you're more than likely going to get asked by our team is, have you gotten out and dug? And why do we ask that question? Because that question gives us a lot of information of what's going on with the planter performance, right? And so that's what we want to do in field checks is as we're going through the field, because as I said earlier, we know acre 0 doesn't equal acre 600. How do we validate that the things we touched and invested in early on our planter are still performing as we get later in the season? And that's where we get into field checks. So we want to dive into the field. And so up here on the screen, we've got side-by-side furrows. What we've done here is we've actually pulled up the closing tail so we could take a look at how our planter was performing. Anybody see any issue with the picture on the left? Looks pretty inconsistent, doesn't it? And in this situation, that inconsistency is going to impact our yield. Versus the picture on the right, that looks really consistent. We're doing a good job. Now, here's what I'll say. We want to catch these, but I know this. I know this about you. I've been there. I don't have time to dig behind every row on every acre, right? We just don't have that capability. So that's where we want to bring in some technologies that will allow us to have that insight in the cab. And for our operation, that's where we brought in the 2020 into our cab. And so up here on the screen, you can actually see our 2020. This picture was taken May 3rd. This is in our North Kegley field. And this is, I wasn't even planning on using this in a presentation. I just like snapping pictures to share with the team during planting season. But this is where we get some good information. This is where we can have some metrics that give us some insight into what's happening in our planter. And as I think about that previous picture of inconsistent spacing, that one metric that really helps us understand that is SRI, or seed release index. And so that's going to help me understand if I have an issue without having to dig behind my planter on every acre. It's still a good idea to dig, but how can I get informed of that while I'm going through the season? So I'm going to look into SRI. And you can see up here on the screen, my SRI, while we were in this field, is 12.9. For me, that's good. I like that. That's healthy. But as we start talking about SRI, what does it really mean? Does anybody know exactly what SRI means? We got one guy. Seed release index. And so seed release index, do we know how that's calculated? Well, it's a coefficient of variation of our singulated seeds. You can see up here, there's a standard deviation curve. I'm not going to lie to you. Those are all words I haven't used since high school. And so as a grower, I need to understand, what's this mean to me in the field? What management decisions am I going to make off of a metric that uses a standard deviation curve? And I started saying, I'm going to visualize it a little bit differently. I want to put a bullseye on my furrow because that's what I'm trying to do, right? I'm trying to hit a consistent spacing. I'm trying to hit a bullseye with every seed that comes out through that meter and through that seed tube. And so as I look up here, I have this bullseye. I start imagining that I have multiple bullseyes on my row. And so what I'm trying to achieve is placing that seed perfectly in the middle of the bullseye. Now, you look up here, you see 6 inches between the bullseyes. That's a function of our population, right? But we want to be consistent in how we're placing that seed down. So now we're in a situation where we say, okay, if I place a seed perfectly in the zeros, I've nailed the bullseye. What does that mean? That means that I have an SRI of 0. Perfect. Now here's the good news, and I guess some of the bad news, that we'll never hit perfect on SRI. Even if we were to take our meters and put them on a meter stand in a completely static environment. Tyler, we talked about taking our meters to a meter stand earlier. But if we do that, we're still looking at an SRI of 9 or 10%. So what does that mean for us as growers? How do we use that metric? Well, what we're looking at, when you start thinking about singulation and good ground contact, we're trying to hit 100% there. On SRI, we're trying to be lower. We want to be in that lower area. But we know between 10 and 20%, we're probably pretty good, right? Well, the way that we use it is we look at it, and you saw earlier, mine was 12.9%. That's when I'm healthy. If I get out to the field the next day, and it's at 20, I know something changed, and I know that I may have more inconsistency in my seed spacing. So what do I need to do? What am I going to look at? Well, SRI, the way that we calculate it, allows us to really hone into 2 key things. One is our drive system. The other one is potentially our row unit ride. So if I see it jump up and I see it go to a place that's not healthy, I'm not only going to start looking at my drive system, but I'm also going to be looking at, do I have slop in my row unit? Is that what's causing my issue? And so SRI is a powerful tool as long as we understand the metric in order for us to make a good management decision when we get out into the field. And so when we put those seeds in the furrow, we're trying to hit that bullseye. And that's going to allow us to know, are we being consistent or are we somewhat inconsistent and random? Make sense? All right, Tyler, we're going to move into depth now. What are we looking for when we do field checks and depth?
Sure, so what I'm looking for when I get out and dig, as it relates to depth, I'm looking to make sure that I've got every seed into uniform moisture. Once I know that, once I've found the depth that allows me to do that, I want to nail that depth. I want to be consistent on every row unit. Now, Caleb, when we were talking about gauge wheel arms wearing out and the depth assembly, we also talked about gauge wheel shimming. That was the check that we did where I raised up the gauge wheel and let it slam back down. We talked about the risk of having a gauge wheel that's not shimmed up to our opening disc, being that we could pinch off or allow some dry dirt to get in between our opening disc and gauge wheel. So I want to play this video and hopefully you can see that happen I've got a gauge wheel that's not up against my opener here, and you can see some dry dirt that's starting to fly up in between the two. Where is that dry dirt going to go? I'm at a significant risk of that falling into the bottom of my furrow, right? And now instead of surrounding that seed with good moist soil, I'm surrounding it with some dry soil. That's going to directly affect my emergence, right? Caleb, we also mentioned opening discs when we were doing our shed checks, and I brought up a W trench, which is what we see up here.
Yeah, that's exactly what we see. So if you go out and you dig, maybe you tied up your closing tail, but if you see this is a direct indication that we may not have our disc opener shimmed properly, right? We've now created the W. You can see the W at the bottom of that trench. What's that going to do? As we mentioned earlier, that could affect our depth. That could bring air pockets around our seed. Both of those are going to directly impact our even and consistent emergence. The next thing we wanted to talk about was our seed tube guard. So Tyler, you want to tell us what we're going to be looking for in the field with that?
I'll jump back in here. My risk of having a seed tube guard that's worn out, Caleb mentioned earlier, is a narrow trench. When I have a narrow trench, I'm at a risk of not getting the seed to the bottom of my trench. Now, some of you might ask, can I overcome that with a firmer? Possibly. If the trench is wide enough that we can actually get the firmer to the seed or to the bottom of the trench and firm it into place, I may be able to get away with that. The risk I have here, though, is whenever we have a seed tube guard that's worn, we could get more dirt in between the opening disc and the guard. And so what that can cause is premature wear of other components in between the opening disc. The picture you see up here on the right, that's a seed tube, and in this case, a furrow jet body. So here for reference, a good furrow with the seed firm to the bottom. Speaking of firmers, the risk of a firmer that is under-tensioned is very similar to having a worn seed tube guard. I risk not getting the seed to the bottom of the trench or firming it into place, and I risk an air pocket around my seed. So it's worth calling this out because I just want everybody to be aware. If we do see air pockets around the seed, we're not honing in on one thing, right? We've got to consider the tension of our firmer. We've got to consider our seed tube guard. Okay? And again, for reference, on the right side, we see a seed that's firmed into the bottom of our trench. Got good moist soil surrounding on all sides. Caleb, that's going to move us into phase 3, and we want to talk about dollar checks. Now, when I was unpacking the 3 phases we were going to jump into today, we really said we wanted to tie all of our maintenance back to ROI, right? A return on investment. I got a confession to make, and I need a little support here.
You bet.
Okay? I need this to be a safe space. When I told my wife you and I were going to be presenting together at Winter Conference, she asked me, what are you going to be presenting about? And I said, well, Caleb and I are going to talk about planter maintenance, and we want to tie it back to, being an investment on the farm. And she said, so like a real investment or like what you said your golf clubs were going to be? That one stung, man.
Yeah.
That one stung. Now, have you ever had any conversations like that with your wife?
No, I mean, we make really wise financial decisions. Like our Traeger, definitely an investment. Polaris Ranger, investment. Automower,
Yeah.
just really.
Caleb, I got it. You answered my question, just not in the way I think you did. So we're kind of trying to make a joke here, but the point I want to make is we want this to be a real investment, right? We want it to be something we put money towards and we reap a reward. We reap a financial benefit. We get more out of it than what we put in, right? That's why we do this. But I think sometimes we look at maintenance a little bit as a cost. Am I wrong?
You bet. You bet. And we do that on our operation, right? And when I showed that old work truck up there, when we start thinking about maintaining that or repairing that, what do we think? Oh, that's dollars we weren't planning on spending. And so the reason, I think we're somewhat trained in this regard, especially when it comes to repairs and maintenance. And one of the reasons I think that is we've got a Schedule F up here on the screen. How many of you have filled out a Schedule F or your tax amendment? We probably shouldn't do show of hands on this. If you're not filling one out, we just won't talk about that.
I think they call that culpability.
Yeah.
We don't want to.
We don't want to talk about that. But when we look at the Schedule F, what we're seeing is line 25. Line 25, repairs and maintenance. What is that under? That's under expenses. That's under costs. And so in our minds, when we look at repairs and maintenance on our equipment, we think directly into costs. Now, I've had to challenge myself in our operation on this. I know my dad challenges himself, my grandpa challenges himself, but sometimes we need to look at this as an investment, right? So when we start talking about the things we talked about today as far as our ability to maintain and get that potential out of the yield, and we start talking about how we can do that by doing maintenance and shed checks on our planter, sometimes that investment is worth it. So let's dive into that a little bit. Let's look at that. So if we look up here, we have our ear potential. We talked about spacing as a possible issue, right? Spacing with our parallel arms, spacing with that seed tube that's been too worn. If we do everything right and we place that seed in the ground and we're wanting to hit its full potential and we have a spacing issue, let's say it's within 4 inches of its neighbor in corn, we're going to see 1/10 of that ear lost. 1/10 of the potential of that ear is gone. Now, if we do the same thing with a more severely misplaced seed, let's say it's 2.5 inches within its neighbor, now we've lost 20% of that ear. 20%. We've already paid for the investment and the inputs in order to make that achieve everything we want it to, and we've lost it because potentially we had a spacing issue. But the reason we've been talking about emergence, and you're going to hear emergence multiple times today, is because of the impact it can have to the operation. When we don't have even and consistent emergence, we have this beautiful ear up here, and we're going to have what we call a late emerger 1, or an LE1. That means it's one collar behind its neighbor. When it's one collar behind its neighbor, we've lost half that ear. Half that ear that we've done everything that we could control right, potentially everything that we can control right, and we've lost half that ear. Then we start talking about an LE2. So we have another beautiful ear up there, and we have an LE2, late emerger 2. That means we are 2 collars behind its neighbor. What happens at that point? Well, it's a weed. We lose everything. We don't put on an ear. So now we have a total loss on that. So I know that this is, as we think through this, it's sometimes hard to comprehend what that total impact is to the operation. So we wanted to break it down. We wanted to put dollars to it, right? And so if we look at up here and we have our LE1, and we say, all right, we have an LE1, and we have it every 17.5 foot. Why do we use 17.5 foot? Well, that's 1/1000th of an acre. I want to make sure that we're all understanding this. We went out and, let's say we took samples on our operation. We did this multiple times. This isn't just one pass where we said, oh, we got one LE1, it goes across the entire operation. We've got an LE1 that we can use as a sample size and spread out across our operation. Now we're at 3.5 bushel of loss per that acre. 3.5. If we take that times $5, which I think fall price for our elevator today was $5.29, so we get a little bit of grace here, but $5, you're going to look at $17.50 per acre. $17.50 per acre of lost potential. Now, we know that we've talked about one row here today, right? We want to do our shed checks on each row. We've really focused in on this row, and we know that if we have something that we've missed or something that's worn down, that row is going to cover more than just 1 acre, isn't it? Well, if we have a 16-row planter and we're covering 1,600 acres, that row is going to cover 100 row acres. So if that one row that we may have an issue with that we didn't get into the details on, and we spread that across 100 rows, now we're at 1,750. And if we look at our LE2s, we have more impact with an LE2 because it's just a weed. We double everything. Now we're at $3,500. $3,500 because of one row that we may not have paid attention to the details. But here's the thing. Here's the good news. These are things that we can control. There are other variables when we go out into the field that we don't have the opportunity to control. When we start talking about planter maintenance, these are the ones we can impact. And so what Tyler and I did is we put up, if we had to replace everything we've talked about today, what would it cost us? We know it's going to cost us time to do the shed checks, but if we had to replace every component we talked about, what would it cost us? Now, don't hear me say that you got to go home and replace every component on your planter. No. What I'm saying is go home, take the time, invest in the planter. Replace what needs to be replaced, because even if you had to replace it all, $665, and you may protect that yield potential, you may end up having a return on investment of well over $1,000 or well over $2,900, depending on how severe the issue is. So it's just an interesting way to look at it. Instead of looking at it cost, look at it as an investment. We are maintaining that yield potential. We're protecting that yield potential by making the proper adjustments on our planner. And so really, I have 3 questions that I want to leave this session with. Number 1, do we maintain our planners when we ought to or when we need to? Right? Do we maintain our planners like a work equipment, or do we maintain it like a piece of performance equipment? Number 2, what can I do tomorrow to make sure I'm set up for success in the field? And then number 3, do I look at planner maintenance as a cost or as an investment? Sometimes we got to change our mindset there. I have to challenge that myself on our operation in that sense too. And so, Tyler, we talked about a lot of different things today, but there's a lot more on the planner. Where can we go for more resources in order to understand what else we can be paying attention to before we get into season?
Absolutely. Caleb, as we wrap up, I want to call everybody's attention to 2 resources. First one being the one you see up here on the screen. Everybody here today has access to this website, precisionplanning.com/maintenance. You can also scan the QR code. Caleb and I touched on about a half a dozen planner maintenance items today. We can't get into everything. There's a guide here at this website that unpacks about 15 to 16 different planner maintenance items and gives you a checklist and a video and a little write-up on each of those maintenance items as to what to look for. So a very powerful resource here I would encourage everybody to check out. The other resource is potentially the person you came with today, but a premier precision planting dealer. So if you have a dealer that you do business with, well, this is that time of year to give that person a call and line up a time for them to go through your planner. Okay? Just to prove my point, Caleb, where is your planner today?
Our planner's at Bottom Line Solutions, our premier dealer, getting parallel arms redone.
Perfect. Thank you. If you don't have a premier dealer you do business with, this same website, but shave off maintenance, precisionplanning.com, if you go there, you're going to find a dealer locator. You can type in your zip code, and it's going to generate or take you to a list of the premier precision planting dealers closest to you. So let this be a call to arms to you. If you don't have a dealer that you do business with, shoulder up with one in your area. So on behalf of Caleb Schleder and myself, I want to thank you all for coming out and being a part of Winter Conference 22 and believing in better. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for coming.